Welcome to CMS Conversations. This afternoon we have the pleasure of chatting with Stephen Heydemann. Stephen is the Vice President of Applied Research on Conflict at the United States Institute of Peace, the USIP, in Washington. He also has a very accomplished academic career. He taught at many institutions. He's the author of the book Authoritarianism in Syria, Institutions and Social Conflict, 1946 to 1970. He's the editor of War, Institutions, and Social Change in the Middle East, and the co-editor of Middle East Authoritarianisms, Governance, Contestation, and Regime Resilience in Syria and Iran. Thanks for watching. Steve, thanks so much for being our guest here at CMS Conversations. We're thrilled to host you at our center.
It's a pleasure to be here, Danny. Thank you.
So, Steve, I've been reading this report, Syria's Uprising, Sectarianism, Regionalization, and State Order in the Levant. And Steve, one of the striking things about this report that I've been deeply engrossed in is that it was issued in May of 2013. Mm-hmm. That's about a year and a half ago. Mm-hmm. And several times as I was reading it, I had to sort of do this chronological gut check because I realized that what you were describing, on the one hand, the picture is very different. This is pre-ISIS. ISIS didn't exist. There's no mention of it, although actually in some ways you kind of prefigure, you anticipate the emergence of ISIS. On the other hand, so much of what you describe in this report from a year and a half ago is still very much with us. So let me quote from one particular passage. You say that as regional actors move into Syria and as violence spills across the country's borders, more than the future of Syria is at stake. The post-Ottoman Empire state order is being tested. Its ethno-sectarian fault lines, already under increasing strain, may yet buckle. So my question for you is two parts. One, what exactly do you mean by the post-Ottoman state order being tested by what's happening in Syria?
Yeah. Well, the contemporary boundaries of the Arab East of the Levant were established in 1916 in an agreement called the Sykes-Picot Treaty, in which a couple of officers, Mark Sykes and Charles Picot, one British, one French, drew lines on a map that basically defined the borders of what we know as contemporary Syria, Iraq, much of the border of contemporary Turkey, Jordan, and those borders...
And Lebanon.
And Lebanon, thank you. And those borders, for all that they've often been described as artificial, for all that they've often been described as having been imposed by imperial powers, nonetheless became consolidated and defined the political order, the state order in the Levant for a century, for a full century. And it was only in the period following the U.S. invasion of Iraq, which I argue in the report was in many ways the trigger for the trends that we see unfolding in the region today,
right,
that a number of sub-state communities perceived an opportunity to redesign the political order, to reshape boundaries, to renegotiate their relationship to what had been the political centers of those states created in the aftermath of the Ottoman Empire's collapse. And we saw that in Iraq, where Kurds and Sunni and Shia began living increasingly separate lives, where an almost independent Kurdistan was created following the U.S. invasion of Iraq. And as conflict deepened and amplified in Syria, we saw similar kind of tensions between the integrity of the Syrian state as it was established in 1916 to 1918 and the aspirations of a number of different sectarian and ethnic communities inside of Syria who no longer viewed the state as the necessary container for their political aspirations. They began to think about other ways to organize their political lives. And those pressures have now risen to the point where I think we can no longer be confident that the post-Ottoman state borders will survive. If they do, I think we have to be aware that what emerges within those state borders may well involve the kind of carving up of political space that we saw in the Balkans, for example.
Right, you talk about the Balkanization of the Levant.
Correct, correct. And so when I refer to testing the state order. It's the emergence of these sub-state political communities who are using the opportunity created by the rise of sectarian identities and the rise of sectarian trends in the Arab East to advance political agendas that ultimately could, if they succeed, bring about the political redrawing of the map of the Arab East.
Now, again, you wrote those lines about a year and a half ago, before the emergence of ISIS. With the emergence of ISIS, you have an explicit territorial claim along the lines that you're suggesting, which is to say a new political entity that calls itself the Islamic State, that is transnational, that is ideological, that has that cuts across two nation states at the moment, but actually has aspirations in its name, ISIL, the Islamic State of Syria and the Levant. It would go even beyond just Iraq and Syria. And so my question for you is, how does the emergence of ISIS over the last few months, and it now controls something on the order of 35% of the territory of Syria. Correct. So how does that change this picture that you're describing? Are things actually now buckling? Have they buckled?
I think we have not yet passed the point at which it is no longer possible to restore the post-Ottoman borders of Iraq and Syria. In fact, one of the ironies of the challenge that ISIS has posed by, in effect, erasing a section of that border is to remind all of the leaders in the region and a number of international actors of the value of stable, consolidated state borders.
Right.
And so we now have the US and others engaged in attacks on ISIS precisely because their hope is to create the conditions where it will be possible to restore the borders that define those two countries for a century. What's clear, however, is that the scale of the threat that ISIS poses, alongside and in some ways reinforcing the other trends that were similarly focused on reorganizing political arrangements in the Levant. Alongside of those, ISIS has really now pushed the intensity of that challenge to a new level. Right. So even though I think it is still probably more likely than not that ISIS will not succeed in establishing a transnational, what we would call a transnational political entity that spans Iraq and Syria as a stable presence in the Levant, it reminds us all, I think, of just how severe the challenge to the state order has become. Ironically, if I can add something, the impact on the integrity, on what we might call stateness, on the capacity of states in the Arab East and beyond has been very, very mixed. Jordan, for example, now I think has greater capacity to manage its borders than was the case before the Syrian uprising.
That is ironic. I mean, you've got a situation in Jordan where I believe its third or fourth largest city is a Syrian refugee camp. You now have waves of refugees in Jordan, where the Jordanian, non-Palestinian, non-Syrian population of Jordan is a minority.
In some areas of the country, in the north in particular, that's absolutely the case. But the Jordanian military and security services are in complete control of the Jordanian-Syrian border. And they have enhanced their presence at the Jordanian-Iraqi border. The Turkish border also, explicitly because of the threat it's come under from jihadists of different kinds, but now ISIS, is expanding its capacity, deepening its capacity to control and manage its borders. So the impact of these uprisings and the violence that has accompanied them in Syria and in Iraq, in some ways has been to erode state capacity in countries experiencing violence and reinforce state capacity in the neighboring states that are under threat from spillover. The one exception to that, of course, is Lebanon.
Yes.
Where in fact, the state has always been quite weak, where it is now struggling to build up its national army to defend its borders, but where spillover from the Syrian conflict has been so intense that I think in many ways we can already see the erasure of the Syrian-Lebanese border having taken place.
And so much of that has to do, of course, with Hezbollah being one of the key protagonists in the Syrian conflict.
Yes.
And the cross-border activity that Hezbollah has been involved in. And so actually that takes me to the next question, Steve, which is, you know, a lot of your report deals with the regional politics, but also the geopolitics of the Syrian conflict. And you write, you contrast Western hesitation, as you call it, with Russian determination on Syria, saying that Western governments opted to cede leadership and influence to Saudi Arabia, to Qatar, to Turkey, in providing financial, political, and military support for the Syrian opposition, essentially outsourcing to those countries. But you argue they've done so, Western countries have done this outsourcing in ways that directly undermine Western interests in preventing sectarian radicalization and political fragmentation on the ground. How have they undermined those interests?
All of the Gulf states that have played the principal role as supporters of the Syrian opposition are engaged in political agendas, or are advancing political agendas that have very strong sectarian dimensions in their own right. In the case of Qatar, it has been the most active supporter of some of the most extreme Islamist armed groups in Syria. And the rationale that Qatar has advanced is that our first priority is to overthrow the Assad regime. These groups are the most effective combatants on the battlefield. Let's support them. If they cause us problems after Assad is gone, we'll deal with them then. Right. So they've made a kind of pragmatic argument on behalf of funding and supporting groups that are now closely aligned with ISIS.
Which cuts against, as you point out, their instinctive fear of popular uprising and mass mobilization. The Arab Spring uprisings, of which the Syrian uprising was an essential part, actually freaked out the Gulf monarchies.
Initially it did. Initially, their fear of politics from below outweighed their perception of the opportunity that Syria represented to remake the regional balance of power in a way that would they feel enhance their security. For the Saudis, it may sound odd to American audiences, but to the Saudis, there's a very strong sense of being encircled by Shia governments.
Right.
Iran, Iraq, Syria, Hezbollah in Lebanon.
Even though the Assad regime is not Shia
exactly. not Shia by any stretch of the imagination, but they've in effect been designated honorary Shia for regional balance of power purposes.
Right.
And even the Houthi in Yemen, a group which has risen up against the Yemeni government, is viewed as aligned with Iran and as representing a community that defines as close as itself as close to Shiism. So the Saudis very much feel encircled, and as the uprising in Syria gained momentum, as it gained in size and intensity, my own sense is that the Syrians, the Saudis, and other governments in the Gulf shifted their view and began to perceive that an opportunity existed to tip the regional balance of power in their direction by pulling Syria out of a Shia axis and aligning it with the more conservative Sunni powers in the Gulf. The way they felt they could do that was by empowering Sunni armed actors, with very little discrimination initially about which groups they funded. And that was, without any question, completely contrary to how the US government views its interests in the outcome of the Syrian uprising. The US would prefer a negotiated power-sharing arrangement in which reasonable elements of the existing regime and reasonable elements from the opposition were able to reach some understanding about how to govern Syria. And the aspirations of the Saudis and the Qataris cut against that very directly.
So flash forward then to the current situation in which there is now a military alliance against ISIS that involves initially the United States and these Gulf monarchies plus Jordan. And now France and Britain have joined. But how do you square this configuration with the conflict that you just described?
Well, there's an unfortunate irony in the emergence of this coalition, because in many ways the U.S. and the Gulf states are paying the price for their earlier approaches to the Syrian conflict. The U.S. in many ways is paying the price for its neglect of Syria, for its reluctance to support moderate elements in the opposition very early on in the uprising. Had the U.S. done so, there's a chance it could have prevented the rise of some of these extremist groups, because moderates would have had the resources to sustain the support of large numbers of fighters. On the side of the Gulf states, they were so indiscriminate in their early funding patterns, they didn't manage private donations to extremist groups in Syria. And so they too, as they come to recognize the threat that ISIS poses to them, are having to adapt their positions and change their policies to clean up the messes that some of their earlier policies created.
Right. Steve, one key regional implication of the Syrian uprising, you contend, has been to embed Turkey in the regional balance of power politics as a Sunni Muslim actor. Turkey's mode of intervention, in other words, the specific way that it's intervened in the Syrian conflict, you write, has amplified and reinforced the sectarian effects of Iranian and Hezbollah's policies, contributed to the radicalization of the armed opposition, and deepened Kurdish Arab tensions among the opposition. It will be increasingly difficult for Turkey, you conclude, to disentangle itself from this mess, this process. And so my question for you is, has this equation that you describe changed for Turkey in the aftermath of the ISIS crisis, where the international mobilization against ISIS has made Ankara sort of reassess, reposition itself?
Yeah, I think that process is underway. I think that process of reassessing on the part of the government in Ankara is in process. It's hard to say that it's yet moved to the point where they are themselves prepared to acknowledge that their earlier policy of support for some of the Sunni factions, some of the more extreme Sunni factions within the armed opposition, can actually be seen as contributing to the rise of ISIS, contributing to the current crisis. They continue to view the possibility that Syrian Kurds could pursue an autonomy agenda or a sovereignty agenda as much more threatening to Turkey's long-term interests than the presence of radical Islamists inside of Syria. I don't think they have yet fully taken on board the role of Turkish support for those groups in creating the current crisis. And that's one of the reasons why at the moment, as of early October 2014, the relationship between the U.S. and Turkey is especially tense. The U.S., I think, would like to see Turkey involved in the coalition against ISIS. The Turks themselves are reluctant to pursue a course that they think might empower Syria's Kurds. And they think that suppressing ISIS could have that effect, especially if Kurds are invited into the anti-ISIS coalition, and there are some indications that these conversations are happening. So the government in Ankara, President Erdogan's government, is quite nervous about where this anti-ISIS campaign will lead. But this nervousness reflects the point I was making in the paper, that they behave increasingly as a Sunni Muslim power in their engagement with the Arab world. And what we see now as we are trying to draw them into the anti-ISIS campaign is exactly those inclinations shaping the way they respond.
And yet they're also troubled by ISIS, are they not? ISIS is now engaged in shooting battles right on the Turkish-Syrian border with Kurdish groups. There are all sorts of ways in which ISIS could cause destabilization of that very fragile region on the Syrian-Turkish border that I was just, where I just visited. The tensions are palpable there. Explain a little bit about how, on the one hand, Ankara, as you say, is very, it has committed itself deeply to the overthrow of the Assad regime and the support of the opposition. But isn't ISIS also viewed as a threat and a force of instability from the Turkish point of view?
I think in the Turkish calculus, the threat of ISIS weighs less heavily than the threat of Kurdish aspirations for independence. I think they do care deeply that the focus on ISIS has distracted the attention of the West and of leading Arab states in the Levant from efforts to remove Bashar al-Assad from power.
Right.
And I suspect that the government in Ankara is waiting for a different balance to emerge in the efforts of the international coalition before it feels completely comfortable stepping on board, even though, as you say, conflict has now reached the Turkish-Syrian border, especially in areas in Syria's eastern provinces. They continue to feel that unless they are confident that the anti-ISIS campaign will not lead to the permanent empowerment of the Kurds, unless the anti-ISIS campaign does not lead to a reduction in the effort to bring about the overthrow of the Assad regime, their commitment to it is likely to be conditional and partial, I suspect.
Steve, you personally have been deeply involved in, from the very beginning of the Syrian uprising, in the democratic transition planning process for a post-Assad Syria, the day after project. I know Afra Jalabi quite well, and she's a contributor to the book that Nader and I co-edited on Syria. You've discussed the potential contours of a proto-democratic, if you will, post-Assad Syria, describing in this report what you call a large-scale experiment in the spontaneous development of local governance, self-regulation, and the formation of civil society institutions that took shape in the country's liberated areas. That, again, we're talking about May 2013. So my question for you is, have these proto-democratic structures and the larger democratic transition process been torn asunder by the whole ISIS crisis and the deepening of the Syrian conflict? Where does that all stand today?
Quite a few of these local governing councils have been forced to close their doors because areas in which they operated have been taken over by ISIS. Civil society in areas that ISIS now controls has been completely shut down. So these experiments, as I called them, were developing along very, very interesting lines, but ultimately, when confronted with a threat on the scale of ISIS, could not sustain themselves. And so we've seen a kind of shrinking of the space in which these independent, often democratically elected local institutions have been able to function. And those are under increasing pressure as the ISIS offensive continues. So I have to say that for all the promise that I think some of these local experiments held in 2012, 2013, we're now seeing just how vulnerable they are to the broader conflict dynamics in which those areas of Syria are engulfed.
Final question for you, Steve. On this anti-ISIS campaign currently underway, is your sense that it will embolden the Assad regime and strengthen it, or will it possibly have quite a different effect, namely to destabilize or take away from the Assad regime this organization, this force that in many ways helped Assad's narrative, right? That he was always engaged in a fight against extremist, terrorist Islam and foreign enemies. That was what he was saying from day one. It wasn't true. It was demonstrably false in those first 9 months and the first several months after that even, with the emergence of the Free Syrian Army. But now, in a sense, it's become a self-fulfilling prophecy. Here we are. And so is it possible that to the extent that this campaign weakens ISIS, does that actually weaken Assad? Does it strengthen Assad? Does it strengthen the Free Syrian Army? How does this play out?
I'm going to fall back on a phrase that's very familiar in Washington. It's too soon to tell. Right now, I think...
Just like the French Revolution.
Right now, I think the consensus among Syrians, both in the opposition and on the regime side, is that the anti-ISIS campaign is working in the regime's favor. We've seen statements of opposition to the campaign from across the opposition spectrum, even from groups with which the U.S. has worked in the past. And one of the reasons is because they don't see that there is a parallel effort to take on the Assad regime by the international coalition. And they see that the Assad regime is very actively engaged in exploiting the efforts of the coalition to create the impression that they are working hand in hand with the coalition. So there will be coalition strikes against ISIS targets, and within minutes of the departure of coalition aircraft, regime aircraft will be in the same area bombing locations nearby. And to people on the ground, it looks very much as if this is a coordinated effort, when it is not a coordinated effort. And so one of the important questions that the anti-ISIS campaign has really brought to the fore is whether or not the members of the coalition will be prepared to take actions that demonstrate more forcefully that they are not working in any way, directly or indirectly, to benefit the Assad regime. And the option that is most actively under discussion right now in that regard is to create a no-fly zone, to create a buffer zone inside of Syria that would be protected by a no-fly zone as a way to make clear that the focus of the coalition is not only the weakening of ISIS, but also ensuring that the Assad regime cannot continue to launch attacks against civilians.
So you write some very harsh words for Western policymakers in this report, Steve. You say that by first tolerating and then more recently endorsing forms of regional intervention that are heavily sectarian in their motivations and intentions, which we discussed earlier, but without providing the means for either civilian protection or a decisive opposition victory, the U.S. and its European allies have embarked on a course that will accelerate the transformation of the Syrian revolution into a proxy war, increase the risk of balkanization, encourage the ongoing spillover of violence into neighboring states, and thus contribute to increasing regional instability and the growing vulnerability of the regional state order. So my question for you is, especially this point about civilian protection, which is the no-fly zone point. Yeah. The Syrian opposition has been calling for no-fly zones from late 2011, and there has never been one. It's been discussed, it's been considered, it's been debated. There's never been a no-fly zone. Anne-Marie Slaughter had a slight variation on the concept of a no-fly zone with a no-kill zone. Mary Kaldor has a variation on that, which she calls a no attacks on civilians zone. The point is, there hasn't been one yet, and I think a lot of people in the Syrian opposition say, well, so the West is now considering a no-fly zone because of the ISIS crisis. What about the last 3 years? What about 200,000 people dead?
Right. It's very hard to avoid the impression, especially among those who've suffered from the violence in Syria over the last 3 years, that the West has been very selective, if not hypocritical, in its willingness to use force against various groups involved in the Syrian conflict. And I think we can understand the sources of that anger and frustration on their part. The same concerns were expressed when the U.S. moved so quickly to protect minorities in Iraq, but didn't seem to be acting as quickly to protect Sunni Muslims in Iraq. So the U.S., I think, the government probably does understand the reactions of Syrians to its use of force in Iraq and in Syria. It also, though, continues to take the position that a no-fly zone is, in effect, an act of war, and that unless the U.S. is prepared to do what is necessary to enforce a no-fly zone, which might include engaging in active hostilities with the Air Force of the Syrian government, with all that entails, that a no-fly zone is not a step that they are prepared to take. I have argued, as you mentioned, for some time, that the costs, the political costs and the military risks of a no-fly zone have been a bit overplayed by the Obama administration. I think there were options available to them, as Mary Kaldor did, as Anne-Marie Slaughter did, in their own ways. But those arguments have not really found much of a foothold within the administration, and I think that continues to be the case. Although I would say that we do seem to be only inching, toward a potential decision around a no-fly zone because of the ISIS campaign.
Steve, there are so many other things to talk about, but this was really a wonderful conversation. I appreciate your time, and Thanks for writing such a fascinating report.
Danny, thank you. I appreciate the chance to talk.